to day 2. I think day 1 went really well. And today we have one of our very own from Rhodes University, Siphokazi Magadla from the Political Science Department, and I'm really excited because we wanted to make sure that we had lots of different voices and not just in humanities, we wanted some social science. So today we have Siphokazi Magadla who's going to be giving us our keynote, and thank you so much for coming. And then Danai Mupotsa from Wits University will chair the session at the end. And so yeah, welcome and enjoy this session. Thank you very much.
Good morning. Thank you so much, Professor Spencer. The title for my talk is From ukuzabalaza to ukutabalaza, from the struggle to hustling, silence and super strength in the lives of women ex-combatants after apartheid. I'm thankful for Dr. Danai Mupotsa for agreeing to chair the session. I'm very happy and honored to be part of this village of African feminists that is thinking about how we have come to be here, how our various worlds are to us, and how we wish to remake them to create the just futures that allow us to be our fuller selves, and futures that allow us to save the planet that is in crisis. As Alice Walker said to a group of black women in 1972, the object of feminism remains that of a commitment to change the world, nothing less or easier than that. Indeed, as Walker argued further, it is a great time to be a black woman. It is a great time to be a woman. A wonderful time to be a black woman, I have found, is not simply rich because from day to day our lives are touched with new possibilities, but because the past is studded with sisters who, in their time, shone like gold. They give us hope. They have proved the splendor of our past, which should free us to lay just claims to the fullness of the future. I wish to thank the organizers, Professor Linda Spencer, Professor Charlene Khan, and their team of villagers, their colleagues and students who have made it possible for us to together at this time. African feminists know better than anyone the physical and emotional challenges that come with making all of this possible in environments where we often find ourselves alone, yearning for a space that reminds us of the reasons we do the work that we do. These spaces, with all their complexities, have the ability to bring us back to ourselves. They allow us to own our wounds and hopefully propel us forward in our commitment to changing the world. Indeed, as Audre Lorde argues, feminist spaces allow us the opportunity of finding new ways of making our ideas felt. As she argues, they allow us the space to battle the old warnings and fears of being silent and impotent and alone while we taste new possibilities and strength. Some of us will carry the energy of this space for weeks, months, and perhaps years to come. I am deeply honored to be part of this theme that centers on the work of Dr. Ntabiseng Modzeme. I first learned of the work of Dr. Modzeme through the work of Professor Puleng Sekgalo in her doctoral study of black women's narratives of conflict and post-conflict experiences. Dr. Modzeme's work has been profoundly important to me and the students that I've worked with. I wrote to her last year that her doctoral study on the lived and embodied suffering and healing amongst mothers and daughters in Chesterville Township in KwaZulu-Natal showed me that it is possible for one to write a study that is highly rigorous in theory and analysis that still feels like it is written for black women. Unlike most of the reading that one does in the academy, when I read Modzeme talk about black women, I do not feel that she's just writing about our lives, but that she's writing about me to me. Like Toni Morrison said of James Baldwin, in reading Modzeme, I feel that she is us. The song she sings is us. Indeed, to quote Morrison again, we are gathered here, dwelling in your language, because in your work you give us ourselves to think about, to cherish. This is my first conference keynote in my life. I am deeply moved and lifted up to be sandwiched between Dr. Mudzeme and Professor Baderun. The ideas that I wish to share today about silence and strength in the lives of women ex-combatants in post-apartheid South Africa draw from my doctoral study on women ex-combatants' participation and exclusion in the state-facilitated integration, demobilization, civilian reintegration process that led to the establishment of the new South African Defence Force and the efforts to demilitarize democratic South Africa. As Mashike notes, post-war civilian reintegration refers to the process of facilitating the transition of former combatants to civilian life, which allows them to adapt economically, socially to productive civilian life. State-assisted reintegration is meant to provide an enabling environment for transition to civilian life by offering ex-combatants a new identity that is compatible with peaceful development and sustainable growth. I had gone into this work with the intention of understanding how women who participated in the armed struggle are navigating their lives in the aftermath. In the end, the work examines the various roles of women in the armed struggle and their lives in the aftermath. For today, I will focus on the latter. I was drawn to this research because my father was integrated into the South African National Defence Force from the Transkei Defence Force and subsequently demobilized in 1996. So I grew up with a lot of soldier talk in my family. Observing my father and his friends who left the military and the profound changes that demobilization came with in our family life, I became aware of the challenges of creating a new defense force out of the 7 armies that were the statutory forces of the old South African Defence Force, SADF, the militaries of the Bantustans, Transkei, Mupotsa, Venda, and Ciskei, and the liberation armies, the ANC's Mkhonto weSizwe, and the PAC's Azanian People's Liberation Army, APLA. As Motumi and Hudson remind us, the new South African Defence Force came into existence at midnight on the 27th of April in 1994, the day that the country held its first democratic elections. As I hope to show, there is a sense in the literature that the rushed integration process was one of the many compromises and casualties of South Africa's negotiated settlement. It is from my father that I heard of the shooting that took place at the Tempe military training base in Bloemfontein. On the 9th of September, Lieutenant Sibusiso Madubela, a former combatant of APLA, shot dead 6 white SADF members, including a white civilian woman at the Tempe military training. Lieutenant Madubela was, of course, from my hometown of Umtata. Other shootings that took place include the one that took place at Palaborwa 7 Infantry Battalion, where platoon commander Lieutenant Harry Tuahaye shot and killed his white senior colleague, and in Simonstown Naval Base in Cape Town, where Wiseman Mchunu shot dead his white colleague. My mother, a psychiatric nurse, used to tell us stories of the many soldiers that they needed to overpower in order to inject them so that they could receive mental treatment. So in my world, at the time, it seemed that soldiers were losing their minds. Outside of the SANDF, some of us remember the public stories of former combatants, many from MK, who became the masterminds of sophisticated cash-in-transit heists. The most popular of these cases is that of former MK combatant who turned South Africa's public enemy #1, Colin Chauke. As Leola Johnson notes in the article, the social bandit after apartheid, Colin Chauke is known for directing a gang in its heist in transit and of staging 2 daring prison escapes. Between 1994 and 1999, Chauke and his accomplices stole millions of rands and then flouted authorities by moving freely among the people as police professed to be vigorously trying to track them down. Chauke was so infamous that he earned himself a line in the poem that I love by Khafela Wamakhodi called Varara. Of course, Makhodi said that Varara is so slippery, it is more slippery than Chauke. Indeed, Johnson even compares Chauke's life to that of the American gangster Al Capone. I'm saying all of this as a way to say that I did not grow up with images of soldiers and combatants as figures that are in control and as figures who can protect broader society. Instead, I first came to know of combatants through the challenges of the integration process of the SANDF and the challenges faced by the male soldiers and combatants in my life and in public culture. At the time, I did not know of the experiences of women combatants in the armed struggle and their lives in the aftermath. The literature on demobilization in South Africa and elsewhere shows that combatants occupy a unique position in public culture in that they are viewed as both heroes and potential threats to society due to their military training. The work of feminists in international relations, in political anthropology, sociology, and other disciplines has assisted us to show that it is really the male combatants who hold the social capital of holding their societies ransom because of their military training. Women combatants, in spite of their training, have less room to rely to access to violence as a way to force the state to deliver public goods to them. Instead, tropes of women's strength are used to explain why women combatants do not use violence like their male counterparts. I show that the women combatants themselves use the language of strength as both soldiers and their strength as African women to explain how they are rebuilding their lives in the absence of state assistance. I argue then that if the soldier or combatant is understood to be strong, and the key definer of African womanhood is also understood to be that of strength, then women ex-combatants require super strength to build their lives in post-apartheid South Africa. I hope to show that the strength articulated in silence can be seen as both a form of resistance and misrecognition of women ex-combatants in post-apartheid South Africa. The broader erasure of women's roles in the anti-apartheid struggle also provides less room to make material and symbolic claims that they can access by virtue of being combatants. After all, there is only one academic book entirely dedicated to women's contribution to the South African War for Liberation. Jacqueline Cox's book, Kernels and Cadres, was published 27 years ago. In South African public culture, women's role in the armed struggle and their lives in the aftermath remains shrouded in mystery and a fixation with women's sexual harassment and abuse in military camps in places such as Angola. In 2012, the Sunday World newspaper ran a headline, Ayanda Dlodlo tells of sex in ANC camp, an article that detailed the current Minister of Public Service and Administration, who was then the Secretary General of Umkhonto we Sizwe's military veterans, Ayanda Dlodlo, talking about how some women entered the armed struggle at such a young age that they lost their virginity in MK camps. Recently, the Mail and Guardian newspaper ran a front-page story titled Women and Freedom. Women freedom fighters tell of sexual abuse in camps. The story detailed the rampant sexual abuses against women in the ANC and the PAC in exile. It featured the story of Sibongile Promise Khumalo, an ex-combatant of the PAC, allegedly raped by the former PAC president, Potlako Lebalo. Some of the women ex-combatants interviewed in this article included the current South African ambassador to Malawi and former MK commander Tenjiwe Mtitso, and former MK member Judy Seidman, who now works for the Kulumani Center. Seidman and Mtitso wrote a response to the article in the Mail and Guardian called Gender Struggle was intrinsic to South Africa's liberation, where they argued that the article by Collinson distorted women's roles in the liberation movement, while maintaining that sexism and patriarchal double standards constrained women's roles in the national liberation. Seidman and Mtito strongly argued that women's roles in the armed struggle and broader liberation cannot be reduced to that of victimhood. More poignantly, they argued, and I quote, "The slander that women in the struggle were treated as sex slaves or sex toys is just that, a slander that denies women our agency, our commitment, belief, and actions as liberation fighters. We are proud that we fought for our liberation." Furthermore, as Ayanda Dlodlo argued in 2011 during MK's 50th anniversary, she argued that the contributions of MK women, for example, are marginalized in the national memory, as the names of these women do not appear in any history book, and nobody sings or shouts slogans about or even mentions in salutation. Examining the process of demobilization forced me to revisit women's war roles. The work builds on Koch's work about what women did during the war, and it examines women's experiences of demobilization and civilian reintegration that remain understudied in the academy and in South African public culture. I argue that the establishment of the Department of Military Veterans in 2009 under the Jacob Zuma administration and the subsequent adoption of the Military Veterans Act of 2011 signal a re-emergence of the combatant as a legislative category and as a category for a debate in South African public culture concerning the legacies of the armed struggle. The re-emergence of the combatant revives questions about the nature of the war that was fought between the apartheid state, the National Party government, and the various liberation movements. Importantly, it revives questions about the combatants who fought in that war and the forms of recognition and benefits owed to them in the aftermath. As Mashike notes, there is no universally accepted definition of a combatant in South Africa. The passing of Mamu Winnie Madikizela-Mandela brought the conversation about the nature of the armed struggle into sharp focus. When Madikizela-Mandela proclaims in the documentary Winnie that those in the townships were the cannon fodder, we were the foot soldiers, we were exposed to the viciousness of apartheid, it allows us to ask why the definition of the combatant during the integration process and in the current legislative framework defines combatants as those who received military training in the statutory and non-statutory forces, when we know that the majority of black South Africans participated in the armed struggle without military training or force numbers. In her article published in 1996 called "The Black Male Gaze, Mbongeni Ngema Sarafina," Colette Geldman quotes Mbongeni Ngema talking about how Sarafina was inspired by Winnie Madikizela-Mandela and the youth of Soweto. Ngema shares that around the time in 1985, I had an interesting conversation with Winnie Mandela that gave the foundation for the musical Sarafina. The conversation was about the youth of Soweto. We talked about their fearlessness and courage that gave them the strength to face the South African Defence Force with nothing but stones and the accompaniment of song and dance. The play centered around a young militant girl called Sarafina and was a salute to the heroines of the struggle, such as Lillian Ngoyi, Fatima Meer, Winnie Mandela, and all the women of South Africa who have committed their lives for freedom. Susan Cook argues that part of the delay of South Africa that South Africa has faced in addressing issues of ex-combatants is due to the resistance by the political elite who have invested considerable energy in portraying the change from apartheid as seamless and a peaceful one. The country's attempts to downplay the violent nature of the conflict and to ignore the messy and not easily narrativized experiences of the various armed factions, South Africa's former combatants remain essentially invisible. Mashike also places the weakness of the initial integration process, integration, demobilization, and civilian reintegration processes on the compromises of negotiated peace. He argues that the ANC's emphasis on reconciliation and the creation of the Rainbow Nation has meant that it was unlikely to tamper with one of the remaining cornerstones of white power, the military, and the economy being the other, which is why the party has never treated former guerrilla combatants as a special social group. It is important then to recognize that discourses on combatants in general have been silenced in post-apartheid South Africa, and specifically so with regards to women combatants, many of whom were formally excluded in the initial state-led demobilization process. As Magadla argues, former combatants are viewed by states, firstly, as special citizens who have paid the ultimate price by putting their bodies in the line of fire for the protection of the state. In this sense, these heroes are understood as the ultimate citizens. Yet secondly, these citizens come heroes present another dilemma in the eyes of states where, if the state fails to support a post-war settlement, the former combatants are viewed as a security threat to the state whose sovereignty they fought for. As Magadla notes, in the democratic ideals central to the nation's identity, military service represented a central obligation of masculine citizenship, and the protection of the nation by ordinary citizens rather than standing army was regarded as essential for self-governance. As she argues further, the citizen who is willing to offer their body in defense of the state and in turn recognized as an honorable citizen. Respect and honor take particular forms in terms of policies, followed by the formation of institutions, resources, and political affiliations that shape the direction of state-assisted support for those making the transition from military life to civilian life. In this regard, the citizen soldier carries a particular civic identity. Writing in the American context, Magadla argues that the common person who served this nation became endowed with a status and was viewed as the legitimate bearer of the claims of his government and acquired a political identity that was a source of collective action and mobilization. Such dynamics raised the resources for channeling benefits for veterans. In every era from the post-revolutionary period down to the present, the question of how the nation should fulfill its obligation to its veterans has assumed a central role in American politics. Scopel argues that it is important to recognize that the US Civil War pensions and other forms of public help for veterans and dependents were not conceptualized in socio-economic terms at all. Instead, they were understood in political and moral terms. By this, Scopel posits that the state assistance of veterans from the Civil War pensions were seen as justly due to the righteous core of a generation of men and survivors of the dead men as a group that ought to be generously and consistently repaid by the nation for their sacrifices. Writing about the civilian integration of disabled veterans after the Second World War, Gerber argues similarly that there is a divided consciousness in the public perception of veterans. On the one hand, the veteran's heroism and sacrifices are celebrated and memorialized, and debts of gratitude, both symbolic and material, are paid to him. On the other hand, the veteran also inspires anxiety and fear and is seen as a threat to social order and political stability. The second, less officially acknowledged response is based on a plausible, though greatly exaggerated, projection. Remove young men from the restraining influences of education, institutions, employment, and family. provide them with advanced weapons and training, and send them off on a violent adventure, expose their minds and bodies to horrific injuries, and then attempt to return them speedily to their life, to the life that they had previously known, and you have a prescription for individual and social chaos. While all integration and demobilization processes take place within a complex post-war context, feminists argue that these processes are highly gendered because they affect men and women in gendered ways. Feminist critiques of demobilization in international relations theory and practice build on a sustained challenge by feminists in the discipline that often presents the thinking and practice of war as a male domain. Feminists argue that war reconfigures all spaces of social life, and that women's contributions to the war economy are central to both its conceptualization and achievement. Feminist critiques of demobilization processes challenge the disregard of women's war contributions that take place in the private domestic realm, especially in the context of civil war. Indeed, various cases of liberation wars and post-colonial wars, especially in Africa, collapse the separation of the private and public, home front and battlefront, in ways that have fundamentally reconfigured the demobilization processes and added more participants beyond the military-trained combatant. Furthermore, feminists take seriously the extent to which the demobilization of women forms an integral part of post-war transformation, because women's inclusions in state-assisted demobilization reflects the ways in which the state and society recognizes women's war contributions and their status in the post-war society. Lastly, feminist literature on demobilization also makes visible the fact that even when women participate in orthodox and unorthodox combat, there is a pressure of being reinscribed in more domestic roles in order to be accepted by society in the aftermath of the war. The civil war cases largely seen in Africa and in Latin America reshape the conception of demobilization in dramatic ways, because the majority of the fighting forces belong within the same state that had opposed each other during the war. This stands in contrast to the cases of interstate war, where soldiers that are demobilized fought on opposing sides. In the context of intrastate war, the process of disarming, demobilizing, and integrating combatants into either civilian society or security institutions, such as the military and the police, forms part of the peace negotiations and is part of a wider peace settlement. The discourse on the civilian reintegration of former combatants in Africa is similar to the experiences in Europe and North America, where there seems to be a general agreement that ex-combatants are a key target group for preferential state assistance to facilitate their reintegration into civilian post-war livelihoods, as seen in cases such as Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Namibia, and others. Of course, in the cases of Zimbabwe, Lyons in the book Guns and Guerrilla Girls, Women in the Zimbabwean Liberation Army Struggle, she argues that most women did not benefit from the post-independence rehabilitation programs designed to integrate women ex-combatants into society. Instead, women were often labeled as prostitutes and thus not deserving of demobilization payouts. Musemwa also noted that while ex-combatants generally face problems of rehabilitation, female ex-combatants face problems associated with conservative, traditional, customary belief about the social and material position of women in Shona society. Many of the female ex-combatants found social reintegration into civilian life particularly difficult, as they were seen by their communities as too strong to be female and too independent, rough, ill-educated, and unfeminine to be good wives. In her comparative study between women's post-war constructions in the Eritrean Liberation Front, the ELPF, and the Sudanese People's Liberation Army in South Sudan, Weber argues that there is a need to interrogate the trope of the fighter as highly gendered construction of performative images of masculinity accessible to men, but with restrictions for women, and idealized fighter as the imagined core identity blueprint for post-conflict citizenship. She argues that although women composed 40% of the fighting forces in the ELPF, which had explicit ideological goal of social and economic and political reform, yet in the aftermath of the liberation in Eritrea, the admiration, support, and legitimization of female fighters, of women in arms, was quickly devalued after demobilization. The emergency phase of war was over, and now the reconstruction of state and society needed women to become normal, feminine, obedient members of society again, so that the society would not feel alienated and would continue to support the struggle despite hardships. Weber further points to the high rates of divorces between the male and female fighters in post-war Eritrea, with the men marrying non-fighter women instead, as an example of the re-traditionalization of society in post-war societies, which place pressure on women to perform a specific kind of femininity in the aftermath. Halim notes that the changes of the role of men from breadwinner to a combatant entitles him to more rights, while the change of the role of the woman from a housewife and a mother to a combatant causes a decline in her status. Cynthia Enloe argues that the representation of female guerrillas in ways that demonstrate her willingness to die for the nation while also evoking her role as a mother, points to the precarious role of the female guerrilla fighter in the aftermath of war. Although there is, of course, a highly contested debate in South African feminism about maternal politics, and in my work I also try to theorize combative motherhood in the anti-apartheid struggle, I am intrigued by the argument that Enloe makes that it is not a coincidence that the female guerrilla fighter is often presented holding a gun and a baby on her back. She argues that this depiction of a female guerrilla indicates to us that there is a social expectation that as soon as the war is over, the woman in the picture will put down the rifle and keep the baby. She asks, where is the picture of the male guerrilla fighter with the rifle and the baby? In this regard, Enloe argues that women's efforts to make the liberation war itself as a site of rudimentary change in relations between women and men will be aided or undermined by the structural transformations that occur during the liberation war itself. So in my work, none of the major case studies conducted in South Africa since 1994 provide any detailed analysis of the lives of the demobilized female soldier. This is despite the fact that even during the official integration process, Van der Merwe and Lamb argue that women faced additional integration challenges, as many of the integration sites did not have adequate sanitation and accommodation facilities for women. There was a shortage of women's uniforms, and there was a number of allegations from women about sexual harassment by male counterparts, which might have contributed to even fewer women integrating into the new South African Defence Force. Of the 36 women I interviewed between 2013 and 2014, from MK, APLA, and Amabuto's Self-Defense Unit, a total of 12 women whom I interviewed were officially demobilized. 10 from MK and 2 from APLA. Of the 12, 10 never integrated into the Defence Force, but instead chose demobilization. 2 MK women briefly integrated into the SNDF and demobilized between 1996 and 1998, respectively. 11 of these participants received the demobilization amount. Most of them, it was the amount of 20,000, which was meant for those who had served between 5 and 11 years in the armed struggle from the 1st of January 1983 to December 1989. One participant from APLA received 42,000 for her contribution, participating as an APLA combatant from 1961. And another two integrated into the SNDF. In May this year, between May and June this year, I also had the opportunity to interview the retired Major General J.K. Sedibe, who was the highest ranked woman in the South African Defence Force after 94. I also spoke to General Siphiwe Nyanda, who was the former chief of the South African Defence Force. I'm going to skip some of this. And I also spoke to the former Director General of the Department of Military Veterans, Tsepe Motumi. Of the 36 women I interviewed, 14 were employed. Of that 14, 11 are former MK, 1 from Amabuto, 1 from an SDU in Mamelodi, and 1 from APLA. Amongst the employed include a former Member of Parliament, Pamela Daniels, the former CEO of Edulone, Dodzi Memela. Some of us know that Dodzi Memela is the MK combatant who was responsible for infiltrating General Siphiwe Nyanda and Mek Maharaj from Swaziland to South Africa for MK's last operation, Vula. The sample also included a recent Minister of Health in the Eastern Cape, Dr. Phumza Gyangi, who worked closely with Steve Biko and Bani Pityana before she left, a teacher, 5 civil servants, a writer and poet, Makhosa Zanaqaba, and the rest of the combatants either own their business or work in the private sector. Those in the private sector include a former combatant, Brenda Badela, whose escape to South Africa was facilitated by Mam Winnie Madikizela Mandela from Brandfort, from where she escaped to Lesotho. Her MK name, Toko Matthews, was given to her by Madikizela Mandela. Badela also happens to be the daughter of the activist and celebrated journalist Mono Badela. Of the 7 unemployed, 3 were Amabuto and 3 from APLA. But overall, for the women who participated in the formal integration process, there was a sense that the financial support given by the state was insufficient for them to rebuild their lives. Many of them, like their male counterparts, returned to families who were poor, who held high expectations that those who were in exile would return home in a better financial position. Many who participated inside and outside of the country gave up pursuing education in order to participate in the armed struggle. It became clear to me that in an economically and challenging post-apartheid context, women carry the heaviest burden of being breadwinners of their immediate and extended families. In such a context, women find themselves needing to be strong for their families. The informalization of the post-apartheid economy has resulted in the cheapening and feminization of work, where women find poorly paid jobs to sustain their families. In her doctoral work on township mothers and daughters, Modzeme argues that the township mothers have found themselves in a post-apartheid context where their children are poor. Many have been casualties to the HIV crisis. Thus, in the aftermath of apartheid, poverty and death remain an everyday reality in South Africa. Women, former combatants, are at the center of this socio-economic crisis, where they carry the social responsibility to find means for their families to survive. It is in this context that I argue that the majority of women ex-combatants have transitioned from the liberation struggle to a life of hustling in post-apartheid South Africa. Most of the women in this sample, employed or not, are the breadwinners of their families. Most of them are responsible for their immediate extended family. Most women who are receiving old age pensions support their unemployed children and their grandchildren. Many of these women have had to find different ways of making ends meet. In the main, for women, young and old, they have to hustle to keep their families afloat. Motseme denotes that ukupanda, a word that is used interchangeably in isiXhosa as ukutabalaza or ukupanda, means she defines it as a way, as a means of finding a way in order to survive, getting by and making ends meet. She argues that this is a social concept that can be found in several communities, particularly the working class throughout the world. noting that the process of hustling involves a set of skills, a way of doing something to create opportunities for income, to achieve often provisional results, such as acquiring groceries, school fees, clothing, toiletries, beauty products, fast food, entertainment, cover, transport support, airtime, and other everyday household necessities. She notes that because for the poor, the needs always outnumber the available resources, the poor often are forced to resign themselves to a hand-to-mouth existence. I particularly like the links that Motseme makes between ukupanda and ukuhlonipha, which means respect. These concepts are often put in opposition. She argues that while ukupanda is about gregariously maneuvering a racist and highly inequitable world among the world's poor, ukuhlonipha involves grounding the oppressed within this unstable and unpredictable world they inhabit through gathering, sharing, and reflection, which offers them an alternative ontological identity of connection. Ukuhlonipha as a religious and spiritual orientation is often put in opposition with ukupanda, which is at times seen as a culture of survival that may include doing illegal activities. In this regard, a woman or mother who has respect, umama oqotho, is not seen as a woman who is on a daily hustle. Yet, when our mothers often say, ukutabalaza, they mean that they are going to make something out of nothing. The majority of women ex-combatants, like the majority of women in South Africa, have transitioned from a life of struggle to a preoccupation with piecing together their lives and those of the extended family at a great physical and emotional cost. The theme of trauma is central, the central one in the research about the post-military lives of combatants. The studies show that beyond the social and economic marginalization, there is extensive psychological trauma of unaddressed pain and woundedness from the violence of apartheid. The absence of the literature on women's experiences of demobilization means that the testimonies by women to the TRC are the only one that represents the psychological trauma that women suffered through that war. Narratives of women ex-combatants allow us to appreciate the various ways in which trauma is expressed in women's lives. A former combatant expressed that the pressure of starting a new life and the difficulties she faced when she returned from exile and tried to rebuild a relationship with a son that she had left behind. I quote, she says, "Look, things were challenging, but I never went for counseling. But I had a challenge, for instance, when I got home, there were so many things I could not understand why they were happening that way, you know. I wanted to fix everything at once, forgetting that we had gotten back to a reality that things would not go the way you wish. So I developed low blood pressure. And with the low blood pressure, I used to get admitted in hospital now and again. And you know, the other thing really I didn't mention was that when I left for exile, I had a baby who I left, who was a year and a few months, a son. Now when I came back, I got back and my son did not know me. That was my biggest challenge, really. It was difficult because he stayed with my mother's sister. When I got back, she prevented me from seeing him. I had serious struggles with my aunt in terms of my child. So much struggle that there was a time when I really hated her. I thought I would never forgive her for preventing me to bond with my child. Fundiswa Menzeni of Amabuto expressed that the daily violence has also had a physical and mental implications for the mental well-being of former combatants. She highlights the lingering traumatic smell of police tear gas, for example. She says, sometimes you observe that there are problems, such as lack of health, people are not doing well. Most of them were beaten too much by the Boers. The tear gas, the tear gas because they mess up with them internally. Fezeka Class expressed that she's not able to look at a dead body today because she saw too many people being killed brutally. Sorry, how am I doing with time? I think I'm ready to. Am I fine?
You're fine. I'm just not following the rules.
Okay, okay. My chair is not following the rules. Okay, I have just a few pages.
Don't tell me.
Okay, I'm just a few pages. Nkosazana Sobantu spoke about the ways in which women struggle today in personal relationships, especially with partners whom they do not perceive as having been active in the struggle, but they are benefiting today. She says, those who are suffering mostly are women with social relations. Sometimes you see when someone is trying to study, but they still have the image that they are a soldier. And sometimes she's dating someone who is not a soldier, who does not understand the way she feels. Sometimes you see a picture of something, maybe corruption, and the person comments by saying, "We did not struggle for this," and yet that person was not there during the struggle. And the person is benefiting from the struggle today. They were never arrested, did not go to exile, and were not part of Amabuto, but today he is benefiting. Another participant shared about the difficulties she faced in her first marriage with a fellow MK member due to their training. She noted that they would come close to attacking each other. She struggled with meeting the expectations that families have within patriarchal society. I quote, she says, "But also what I see as a major problem is the fact that we went to a state of war, as you know. When a soldier fall, you can't leave him. You must carry your dead. You must watch your dead. You must take care of them, you see. You leave, you do all of these things, and then you come back. There's no debriefing. There's no psychological debriefing, and you're expected to integrate and live a normal life. I mean, really, that is not practical. That is not realistic, you see. In the military, you live in a certain way. There are those rules. There are these rules. There's a discipline of the military, and you tend to want to live that way, even in a family environment. And that will translate to a lot of challenges with children, because with my late husband, we were both soldiers. And even when we do things, we used to come to a point where we would say, okay, we will shoot each other. We were equally trained in our individual rights. In our individual right, we were commanders, because in our training, we were told we are all commanders. We were trained. We did a commander's course, and families would not understand the way that way of doing things. So I tried to show that most women have found different ways to deal with psychological trauma, often outside of seeking professional help. In the main, most women are still going through individual journeys of reconciling their current behaviors with the past. It is clear from my findings that greater institutional attention ought to be paid to women's psychological well-being. But one gets the impression that although communities are aware that women suffer from these difficulties, women are often expected to endure. The view that women are stronger than men psychologically obscures the real ways in which trauma remains unaddressed and expressed in women's lives. While the theme of trauma was salient in women's articulation of the emotional and psychological challenges that they face in recreating their lives after apartheid, there was also a repeated articulation of women's emotional and psychological strength, which enabled them to withstand burdens better than their male counterparts. When asked if women had been involved or attempted to engage in violent criminal activities when they found themselves facing economic and personal challenges, women's strength was expressed as a way of pointing to women's coping abilities. Dr. Phumza Kyangi used strength as a way of explaining why destitute women ex-combatants have not turned to alcoholism or violence like their male counterparts. She argues that lots of people are destitute, MK, both women and men. That's why there is not much difference, but men tend to be more accepted than women. I suppose we are stronger than them. Psychologically, stronger than them, because you find a woman that has been exiled, who's not working, who is trying to make ends meet, who's not a drunkard and an alcoholic. But you will find men, most of them are alcoholics. I think it's a matter of them being strong psychologically. Another MK ex-combatant also argued that women may be perceived to be physically weaker than men, but they are psychologically stronger. She argues that I believe that men are naturally weaker than women. We may be weaker physically because we are called the weaker sex. Physically we may be weak, but in terms of our mindset, we are stronger than men. We are used to dealing with pain. I think we are also designed to take care of others, and men are not designed for that. Hence my break is so easy. And they bottle things inside. We talk about things. When they bother us, we cry, and most men still believe that men are not supposed to cry. It's a healing process to cry. So I didn't really have to go through a counseling process, she says. Again, Pamela Daniels reiterates this point when she says, the male character is different from ours. We are children bearers. We are home builders. We are the ones who are supposed to be strong for the family. We are caring for the families, and I would think that we are supposed to be having the same responsibility. But what I have experienced is that our male counterparts, they abuse alcohol. Not that we don't have those challenges as women, but it's a much rather controllable rate than our male counterparts. Maybe because we also stayed with them in the camps in exile. They got married to foreign women. We were just brothers. Even we were women. We were soldiers. They did not look away. But when we came back, our families were there. Families did not accept that the women that they came back with, and it created a lot of tension, and they became targets to women. And of course, no offense, women inside the country have this belief that the male soldiers have money. They have all the benefits, and every other thing is happening. As you can see, we live in a society where you are who you are because of what you have. So I think there are these challenges that we are facing, that we are seeing in our counterparts, of course. We also have challenges, but we are in a much better place than our male counterparts. Moteme points out that often the use of silence as a coping strategy is interpreted as strength, in a sense that it is read as women's capacity to withstand high levels of pain and physical and mental violation. She argues that the strong woman myth has contributed to the limited understanding of women's notions of pain, suffering, humiliation, joy, which remain limited within the social sciences. In her doctoral work on township mothers' subjectivities during apartheid, she argues that whether intended or unintended, what emerged from these kinds of framing of townships and township subjectivities was a systematic erasure of resident subjective experiences and voices, and how this violence had intimately folded into everyday lives and became a source of embodied existential suffering, as well as a basis to act creatively. Moteme's analysis is important for this analysis in the process of my research, because I became suspicious of the narrative that women veterans have not participated in post-apartheid criminality and violence like their male counterparts because they are stronger than men mentally. As Moteme explains, the stoic figure, of course, is a very common one in African women's iconography. A stoic person is basically someone who appears unaffected by emotions and is generally admired for showing patience and is in the face of adversity. Themes of resignation, endurance, and grief, so memorably embodied in women's stoic bodies, are strong themes in surviving oppression and poverty. In this sense, stoicism is then strongly associated with performing dignity in the midst of hardship. These imposed and self-ascribed notions of women's strength is an unarticulated but accepted assumption in the literature regarding why, for instance, women have not used their military training to pose a security threat to the state and their communities after '94. It is important to point out that these silences in the narratives provided by the women and the ways in which they reveal the extent to which women cope with the transition to civilian life, as well as how the same narrative of strength poses the danger of obscuring women's need for assistance in integration in material and psychological and symbolic ways. One can imagine that the image of the stoic figure becomes amplified when one is a combatant. The historic image of the sacrificial soldier and the sacrificial mother becomes intertwined, and thereby leaving little room for women to articulate their personal challenges and their need for state assistance in post-apartheid South Africa. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll take one round of reflections. So structure your sentence as a reflection.
Thank you very much for your talk. I don't have words actually to say what it means to me to sit here and hear you speak. My question is this, when I maybe focus on the situation in South Africa. I'm wondering about the construction of the femininity that rejects the black woman as the soldier, as the fighter, as saying they're too hard and now this is not feminine, at the same time as constructing this kind of idea of the woman who's supposed to hold the dignity and who's supposed to be. So I'm wondering about the construction. One of the reasons I'm wondering about this is because there are certain theorists who call themselves post-colonial or decolonial, whatever they want to say, and they would have it, for example, that gender didn't exist anywhere in Africa until Europeans brought it. So I'm wondering about what, in this construction, do you understand this as simply a European imposition and then a renegotiation, or are you understanding it as maybe influences coming from European conceptions of femininity, but also there are influences that came from South African cultures as well, etc. So I think we could talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was an extremely rich discussion, and Danai has asked me to do a reflection on the question. So,
Okay.
two reflections. I'd like to think about the temporalities of struggle.
And how the study and this notion of demobilization and moving from militarized struggle to hustling makes us rethink that temporality, and also to reflect on strength and privilege. Are you only strong because you do not have the privilege to be weak?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Yeah, sure.
Oh my God. Thank you so much. I think you just blew so much right over.
I have goosebumps. So thank you very much. I think that, wow, okay. So, and I think part of what you've shifted quite significantly for me is around ideas of what is constructed as kind of impossibility for radical women. And I think that also, so many of us were raised as we were trying to be questioning women to like that image of the right, the image with the contradictions, with the right, even if we were not aspiring to motherhood necessarily, but to certainly think of it as a productive contradiction in ways that are, that kind of work for transgressive femininities. So that's incredibly useful to so it's I'm incredibly grateful, that's what I want to say, for how you've kind of completely troubled that. I am wondering about this incredibly valuable intervention you're making in this paper into so many areas of just about everything. Right? About constructions of femininities and masculinities, our ideas about memory and collective memory and the kind of science that we claim around criminality, around how to question even those spaces that are progressive in thinking, including some of our own within African feminist spaces. But I'm wondering what your thoughts are in terms of what this incredibly rich archive that you're building teaches us about. So you said that thing, because I wrote it down, sorry, because I'm not going to remember it. You said something about the way in which the integration or the non-integration of women ex-combatants was also always a flirtation with the re-traditionalization of societies post-conflict and war. And so what is my question? I know I was also doing a reflection, but I feel like there's a question there. But I don't know what the question is, but the question has something to do with the larger re-traditionalization, right? So when you were talking about the scholarship from Zimbabwe, for example, that's so useful for so many of our work in terms of the prostitute figure and the urban and the in different disciplines. I was wondering about there's something about a general re-traditionalization in Southern Africa, in post-apartheid South Africa. I don't know what the question is, but it's something linked to that. So that's a very messy reflection, but really just enormous appreciation. I think it's shifted just about everything right now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Sure.
Thank you so much, Siphokazi. That was, I had the tingles on the head and everywhere. So, and I want to reflect on the richness of it, and I think it's about a question that Habibi's been asking. And I was talking to her this morning, never got to finish it, and it was about the sorting of intellectual traditions and the question of intellectual lineage. And I was linking it to another conversation I had with one of the participants yesterday about one of my turning points in my life was when I reflected, it was during, I think, the time master's, when I was doing the PhD, when I saw that a lot of my intellectual lineage and tradition was drained from was, number one, predominantly Western, predominantly white feminists. And then even at the lived experience, having worked, I worked when I came out of university. I started teaching at UCT, UWC, consequently, how in some of, because the academic spaces as well, I was usually youngest, only one.
Sure.
So even my whole embodiment thing, in terms of legacy and all of that, a person was drawing from those spaces as well. So the point of looking, say, oh, wait a minute, existential. What am I doing? What am I doing?
And that whole turning point of saying, let me consciously draw on my mother, let me consciously draw on my grandmother, let me consciously draw on where I grew up and who I am. Reorientating myself towards that, and in terms of my own reading as well. And to me, just in terms of your richness, I think I also want to speak to really a lot of the young scholars who are here. That's when you're able to begin to write with richness. And that's when you're able to write with you heard the ease that she was reading. It's rich, but it's also, there's an ease and a flow. Because I think in her writing, I'm sensing her locatedness and all of those other things. And so I think, I just wanted to share that when you actually make that conscious, it actually becomes, writing will never be easy, but there's a certain ease and a flow and a sense of integrity as well in your writing, and a connection that is ancestral. You're part of this kind of long, lineage and history. It does mean you wrestle with it. Of course, you wrestle and all of those things, but there's something there, I think, around there for some of us, So I think when people say, it's really rich, is that for me, I think that's what it's speaking to. It's speaking to a struggle, a very long struggle of self and writing and locating yourself as a writer, as an academic, as a scholar in your work where we are now. So I just wanted to talk about that. And then just quickly, my comments were I was also writing. One of the things that I just wanted to talk to you about are mainly two things, and then I have quick comments as well. The one was around the issue of, because of death, and the issues of death, and of course the issue of women soldiers, and the issue around what happens to those bodies, and not only in the body politic and kind of creating a nationalist politic and discourse around nationalism. Do they feature? How do those, where are they buried? Where are those women buried? Are they buried alongside the heroic men? Is there some, so are we even seeing this, we're seeing this traditionalization that you're talking about, not even just in the visually in real life, and whether it's through visual images, etc., but even in death, is this kind of, so I'm very interested in what happens to women's bodies, particularly who are soldiers, where are they located, how they integrate into the symbolicness of nationhood, and what happens with state rituals around women's dead bodies, etc., and all of that, and how are they imagined as part of the the heroic, the ancestral within your work. So I'd be interested to hear on it. The other one I'm very interested in is the whole thing, the question you talked about reintegration. So I'm really interested in, a lot of the work on in African context, in a lot of African communities, post-mobilization after war. There's the whole thing of reintegration, not just as a state discourse, etc. So you've had, like, I don't know whether you've come across the word Plombana, Lucinda, sorry. Lucinda, you've come across her work. So her work is around the whole issue of communal integration. And I'm just thinking some of them that I found, where I found this thing of having askaris in the communities, of having abantu in the community, people who are traitors in the community, and that reintegration at a very grassroots community level of how that happens as well. Because when you've killed, there are certain rituals for you to be reintegrated into the rituals. I'm talking, within an African cosmological sense of cleansing or that happen. Where's that space? Is it, that kind of the communal aspect of it, which then is so important about the reproduction of the kind of the person in the community. And then finally, I promise. Two comments, just comments. These are just comments, no more question. I was writing something and I'm thinking, armed struggle, reintegration, demobilization, hustlers. So that was the one thing. The other last one comment that I wanted to hear from you. I just find it so problematic that we can't agree as scholars that South Africa was under a civil war. It's still like we need to contest it. I need to prove that. And I think, I just wanted to hear your comment that this was a civil war. Thanks.
I can't say this without getting shut down. There's a piece that you spoke about how there's images of like women having a baby at the back with a rifle, right? And when you see the guy, he doesn't have that, right?
And the way in which you read that image is, or what you articulated was more like, there's an expectation that the rifle will come down and a woman goes back into a domestic sense. And my question is more around like, why would you see that as an oppressive state, or rather than as a substantiating state that women are generally stronger, they can do both. And if you would read that image in that sense, then it would beg another question to say, why is it that we're not teaching the man to carry the baby at some stage, especially within a narrative, in a South African, a black woman narrative where we could sit here as feminists and have these discussions, but our boys are still being raised as boys and living in the back house and coming in with women and no one's confronting them. So why are we not changing the way in which we're teaching our boys to look like in pictures, right?
Yeah. There's no need to shut you down for saying that. Yeah. Thank you so much. I think some points I'll speak to, because there are some connections. I'll respond to multiple questions at one go. So Janine's question was about, if there is part of the argument by a number of African feminists is to argue that in its essence the African family is matriarchal or matricentric, as Amadume argues, then what is wrong with the presentation of the African woman as strong and as maternal? I'm not sure if I'm phrasing your question right, or if maybe, what is it, hang on.
That's okay.
Yeah.
You can answer whatever question
Okay.
you like.
Okay. Yeah. But it was something about the construction of the combatant, right? Of the feminist.
So virulent against the black women that have fought. Where does that construction
coming from?
Where do you think that comes from?
Yeah. Okay. I get that. This is the puzzle, because if we draw from that history that talks about these matriarchal foundations, then it makes sense why African women become guerrillas, right? And why they were guerrillas, and the fact that African women have always worked, and so when we came to a point where they had to work to liberate the country, they went and did that, right? And so why does it become a problem when they come back? And so this is a theme that is dominant from the women that left the country to be trained. There is a difference because most of the women that I spoke to, all of them had children, and they had children with former MKs. Those who got married and they had married MKs were either divorced. So most of them were not married, and their explanation was that when they came back, it became difficult for their partners to deal with them. And so then we have to ask, what is it about the conceptions of the African man of what femininity is useful after apartheid? So now it's like we could be soldiers there together. We all received the same training. They received the same training, unlike the white women in the SNDF who could not go to combat. Right? And then now when we get to liberation and everything is supposed to be great, they're like, in fact, I want a particular kind of woman. And so a lot of them, so she's here in PE, she says, relationships with men, they just don't work. So there is that assumption that they are too strong. And so I think it is about also African men accepting a very constraining European kind of femininity, right? And so, I think that captures that. And I mean, I like the question about the rifle and the baby. You know, I've been sitting with this question with Enlo for years now, because part of what I argue is that the images that you see in Voice of Women, the images that some of them appeared on Sichaba. There's a beautiful article by, I'm forgetting her name now, it's called Moms with Guns. And what she argues there, she reads these photographs, is that the ANC was aware that the majority of South African women went to fight apartheid with their babies on their backs. So part of what I argue for the distinction in terms of age and the spaces from which women fought was to say the people that could physically leave the country for training were young women of teenage age. So most of them were girls. So that's why I make this distinction between guerrilla girls, combative mothers, and what I call in-betweeners. So they were aware that actually we're talking about a minority, and all the women I spoke to, they're saying, I mean, it was a rare case where you would even have 10 women in the camp. Women were always the minority. So the ANC was aware when they were saying, we are inviting you to a people's war, the ways in which women were participating was with their children, because their children were being attacked in schools, in their homes, everywhere. And so it's not a distortion or misrepresentation of how the majority of women participated. But what happens then in the integration process is that then we privilege those in the main who were trained outside, and those are the young women who could leave. And the ones who were inside, whether they were young or old, are excluded from that process. And so then in South Africa, we can't really talk about communal integration, because there's a feeling from those who fought in the self-defense units that saw themselves as carrying the mandate of MK, that we were never demobilized. So the kind of literature you see from Uganda, from Sierra Leone, from Liberia, you don't see that in South Africa. And there are already case studies early on by we don't like them, by the World Bank, a number of case studies about DDR processes as South Africa is going through its own DDR process. And so part of my own wondering is, why did South Africa did not take the findings from various countries, including Zimbabwe, including our neighbors, but you don't have a sense of that. In a way, what I argue is that the integration process treated the war as if it was a conventional war, as if MK people in APLA were facing the SNDF head on, but it was not that. It was a guerrilla war. So it's a distortion of what kind of war it was. And then, of course, the point you end on is about. And so one of the things I argue is that there's no contestation that Zimbabwe went through a liberation war, that Namibia went through a liberation war. But here, when we talk about the struggle, it's not clear that it's a war. And part of it, what Badat argues, he argues that maybe it's because of the urban nature of the struggle. So, like with, Che Guevara, with Mao Zedong, the argument is that the guerrilla war starts from the hinterlands, from the mountain, from the rural areas, into the city. And this is what is in common in China, in Cuba. But in South Africa, the heart of the beast was in the townships. And so perhaps that is part of the distortion. That is why South Africa does not fit comfortably even into the history of how we understand guerrilla war. The question about re-traditionalization from Prof. Gola. I've been trying to think about this question in trying to understand the EFF. Because there is an understanding. When we say things the way he does, when they dress the way they do, to me, there's a fundamental understanding that this country went through a war. So the memory that we are playing on is a very alive memory of people that were active in the 1980s, because the country was ungovernable. So they are very aware of it. But my argument is that it is a championing of a particular kind of warrior citizenship that still imagines that the male is the soldier. And so that's why I've thought it's important for us to ask, why are these women so quiet? Why are the women in the EFF not saying anything? Because it tells us, there's been an argument that South African feminists could see in the early 90s the importance of achieving equality and having it embedded in the constitution. And so in a way, I think we believed that that would, we would avoid some of the pitfalls that the Africans that gained independence before us experienced in terms of women's representation. But now, of course, this context of femicide, it is forcing us to ask questions about the limitations of liberal feminism, you know, and the reality that the achievement of rights is not a goal on its own, that the thing about the society has not fundamentally changed. I do think it is also connected to the fact that the legacy of the war itself remains unaddressed. And so it becomes articulated then in very conservative ways that are gendered, that can only mean havoc for women. I mean, and then I'm trying to jump around. Whew. You know, the question about, the comment about death is quite important. I mean, I'm not sure if we have sort of popular graves of women who fought in the liberation struggle. I mean, we know when it's Youth Day, people visit Hector Peterson's grave, right? And as soon as they open Mandela's one, people will go there. I'm not sure how many people will even go and visit Ruth Mombati's graves because they don't know who she is, right? And I mean, that's something I'm going to think about because you are reminding me, when I met Umamu Ndwe Mankahla worked during the sabotage campaigns in PE with Raymond Mhlaba, with Governor Big. She was 18 at that time. And I remember, we went to clean the graves. I think Mayekiso's grave is also in PE. They were cleaning those graves. There was no woman in the people that were there. And so, I mean, she was recently given the presidential order in last year. But even she has had to fight to say, I was a combatant, I worked with these people. The sabotage campaign could not have been, they could not have been successful without our activities. And so I am going to think deeply about that, actually. It's not something I'd thought about because I was so concerned with getting the women that are still alive. Because I mean, when I was still, I was told all the time that, oh no, they're too traumatized, they don't want to talk. There's only one woman who refused me an interview, and it wasn't because she didn't want to talk, it was because she thought I needed the approval of the ANC in order for her to speak to me. And I spoke to women individually. In one meeting of someone I won't mention, I got the cell numbers of Umamutendwe Mtito, I got them cell numbers of Minister Mapisa Ngakula in one meeting. And so these women, after getting access to one, they would just say, oh, talk to her. So it's not true that they have been unwilling to give interviews. Sorry? Yeah, and I think it is our role, to do that kind of work. And so now, I mean, fortunately, my very first PhD happens to be someone, Umamu Sindingabi is the niece of Mamu Ruth Mombati, and she is doing her PhD on her aunt. And so I'm sort of very hopeful, and I mean, and her aunts are all of these people that are these historic figures. And so I'm hopeful that maybe she will address some of these questions because she'll have to follow Mombati through the various countries that she went to, and maybe then she can begin to even ask about, how many women are whose bodies are being repatriated, from Tanzania, from Lusaka, and so forth. I don't know if I've skipped somebody. I think maybe I can stop.
Okay, so I want you to join me in saying thank you, expressing our deep gratitude to Dr. Magadla, who's done something that is, and done so many, like Paul was saying, so many habits, like you just were like, doop, 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 all of them. And I was thinking dense when you said thick, like this kind of really dense, to embed like pain and humor and intellect and kindness into a way of thinking about how we know the world in such an incredible way. Thank you so much. Very deeply grateful.
Okay, we're running a bit late. Chairs, please take that into consideration. We'll just have tea very quickly. So